Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on the drivers of oil demand, where we will discuss the role of petrochemicals in resolving plastic pollution. As some of you will know, Planet Tracker is supporting a group of investors who are calling for petrochemical companies to address plastic pollution issues. And today we want to dive deeper into the what, the why, and the how. So over the next 30 minutes, next slide, please. We want to start by exploring what environmental issues and social issues plastics are causing. We will then dive deeper into the role of petrochemicals and the life cycle of plastics. Afterwards, we will explore the regulatory landscape and the recent developments in the policy arena. We will then look at what risks are associated with plastic pollution and what specific risks investors in the plastic value chain are exposed to. And lastly, and probably most importantly, we will discuss how investors can mitigate these environmental, social, and financial risks and get involved in the investor statement many other asset managers and asset owners have already signed. You won't just be hearing from me today. I'm particularly excited to introduce our speakers and experts to you. First of all, we have Manon Koelewijn-Timmerman. She is a project manager covering responsible investments at the Dutch Association of Investors for Sustainable Development, BBDO. We have Richard Wielechowski, who's the head of our petchem research here at Planet Tracker. And then we'll also have Arthur van Mansveld, who is a senior engagement specialist at Achmea Investment Management. We're very happy to have them on board. And before we dive in, I just want to do some very quick housekeeping. If you have any questions, please add them in the Q&A. We will try and pick them up and answer them either in the chat or after the presentation. If we don't get back to you in time, we'll answer via email later on. And also just to note that this webinar will be recorded. So there's a lot to get through, and I would suggest we would dive straight in. Manon, we are excited to have you join us and talk us through the issues that plastics are causing. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Nicole, for your introduction, and hello to everyone joining this webinar. So my name is Manon Koelewijn-Timmerman, and I am a project manager for VBDO's collective engagements with fast-moving consumer goods companies and retailers, together with 190 institutional investors. So for those of you who are not familiar with VBDO, we are the Dutch Association of Investors for Sustainable Development. And as a multi-stakeholder platform, we encourage the private sector to integrate sustainability at the core of operations for both companies and financial institutions. So a little over a year ago, VBDO launched an investor statement calling on FMCG companies and retailers to reduce plastics, especially single-use packaging, and to implement reuse and refill systems. We called on them to support ambitious policies and regulations and to transparently address toxicity in the value chains. Next slide, please. The whole plastics life cycle poses a serious and growing threat to the environment, to climate, biodiversity, human rights, and public health. Accumulating research continues to emphasize the gravity of these impacts, but the picture is already clear. Intensive production and use of plastics is causing untold damage to the health of people and planets, with scientists affirming that cleanup is futile if production continues at this current rate. The prevalence of micro and nanoplastic pollution is also a topic of serious concern. Micro and nanoparticles have now been found in the most remote places on this planet, in many types of ecosystems, as well as in the human body. Recent studies have identified that microplastics have now been found in human lungs, in our blood, and in the brain. So this growing understanding of the environmental and human health impacts of micro and nanoplastic particles are the significantly higher morbidity rates of the workers that work in the plastics value chain emphasizes the current threat posed on humanity and the planet. This in itself should absolutely be reason enough to reduce and to rethink plastic production and use. Next slide, please. But currently, we are facing a scenario in which this production of plastic polymers is still rising as it is a major component of global petrochemical demand. It is forecast that the use of plastics could almost triple by 2060, and that the petrochemicals will become the main driver of persistent growth in oil demand. Under a business as usual scenario, as can be seen in this slide, in 2060, fossil fuel-based plastics will continue to dominate, while recycled plastic will only be 12% of total production. And as a result, life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from plastics will more than double, growing to around 4.5% of total global emissions. In this scenario, plastic leakage to the terrestrial environment is forecast to double from 22 million tons in 2019 to 44 million tons in 2060. Moreover, the buildup of plastics in aquatic environments is forecasted to triple. As such, a business as usual scenario is detrimental to the environment and society, and thus needs to be addressed at the core. Next slide, please. We have engaged with fast-moving consumer goods companies and retailers on their plastic strategy, which is very much needed. And while they are acting upon it to various degrees, we cannot tackle the plastic crisis by ignoring the source of it. Some numbers: there are over 16,000 chemicals used or present in plastics, including the monomers that are bonded together to form polymer, and also including various additives and processing aids. Of these 16,000 chemicals, only 44% have information indicating they have been evaluated on toxicity or other hazards. Amongst around 5,800 chemicals which have been tested, 4,200, so 73%, are identified as being hazardous. Simultaneously, there's growing scientific evidence of the negative impacts of hazardous chemicals on human and ecosystem health. In 2015, the human health costs in the USA alone have been estimated at $675 billion, resulting from exposure to only 3 of those commonly used chemicals in plastic. So to sum it up, we are actually facing a major plastic crisis that needs to be halted at the source, and a business as usual scenario must absolutely be prevented. With massive negative impacts to the environment and human health, there is a clear demand to deviate strongly and quickly from this business as usual scenario. Continuing like this will result in immensely high cost to society from an economical, social, and environmental perspective. So I will leave it at this, and I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Manon. It's quite clear that plastics are causing significant environmental and human health issues from what we've just seen. And looking at the future projections of plastic production, one question that many will have is who these actors in the value chain are that can help mitigate these impacts. And that leads us to our next section on the petrochemical industry and what the role is in this. Richard, we're very happy to have you here, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Nicole, and thanks everyone for joining. So, what is the role of petrochemical companies in plastics? Why does this webinar focus on them rather than others involved in the plastic value chain? Now, throughout this webinar, we've used the image of a tap spewing out plastic. Now, as well as being a great visual, it's actually an image which can help us to understand the role of petrochemical companies in plastics. They are the tap pumping out the raw materials of plastics. They take the fossil fuel feedstocks and turn them into the polymers, which are then melted, extruded, and formed into the plastics other corporates use. On this slide, we highlight the petrochemical players in the left-hand box as the upstream segment of the plastic value chain. Their production is then used by companies such as those involved in containers and packaging to make the bottles, boxes, and plastic wrap, which we here refer to as midstream. And those produced plastic products are then used by downstream players such as FMCG companies. Now, it's important to note that petrochemical companies are embedded in this value chain and thus the problem of plastic pollution. But too often, the focus for addressing plastic pollution is only on the right-hand side of this chart, with actions such as reuse or recycling. Of course, this focus only on downstream solutions is very much to the liking of the upstream players, and they've historically lobbied and spent significant money to deflect attention from their own role in the problem. So let's move on now to discuss where we stand on the Global Plastic Treaty and broader regulatory developments. Firstly, there's been a steady increase over the past decade or so in the number of national level policies focused on addressing plastic pollution. For instance, laws banning certain single-use plastic items, such as plates or cutlery, as we saw introduced by the EU in 2021. On this slide, we show how there's been this steady build-up in these plastic-focused regulations. And these increasing national efforts have really set the ground for international work on the issue of plastic pollution and the ongoing effort to develop a global plastic treaty. But what is the Global Plastic Treaty? Well, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC, on plastic was created by the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, and began work in the latter half of 2022. It aims to complete the negotiations by the end of 2024 with implementation from 2025. The treaty aims to create an internationally legally binding instrument to address plastic pollution both on land and also in the marine environment. The instrument has the goal of addressing the environmental and health harms associated with plastic. There's so far been 4 rounds of negotiations, with the latest concluding in Canada at the end of April. The 5th round is scheduled for Busan in Korea in November 2024, when it's hoped the treaty will be finalised. However, despite the 4 rounds of negotiation so far, there remains a number of contentious points which remain to be decided. Most notably, these centre on the scope of the treaty and whether it should include focus on production reduction or only on waste management. Clearly, a focus only on waste management would be welcomed by the petrochemical industry, as it would have minimal impact on their growth plans in the medium term. There's also disagreement about how to address chemicals of concern in plastics and how they impact the environment and human health. Now, importantly, this is one area which will continue to be negotiated ahead of the next INC in November as part of so-called intersessional meetings. Finally, there remains debate on how efforts to address plastic pollution should be financed. To date, negotiators have opted for more traditional approaches, either through a newly dedicated multilateral fund with developed country donors taking the lead, or a hybrid approach involving flexible and innovative finance that leverages the private sector to catalyse public financing. Industry participants, however, are keen to avoid any producer pays approach, such as extended producer responsibility. So moving on to how petrochemicals are involved in this debate. Now, in our view, the companies are very aware of the potential threat a comprehensive global plastics treaty could represent and have been increasing their efforts to shape the negotiations. This sits alongside their ongoing and historic efforts to lobby against a watered-down national level legislation. We note that at INC4 in Canada, there was a 37% increase in the number of petrochemical-linked lobbyists and industry representatives versus the prior negotiating round, according to analysis by SEAL. This really underlines that the industry is stepping up its obstructive tactics as the treaty nears completion. So what are the risks petrochemical companies are facing? I'd say their lobbying efforts confirm that they know that regulation is a risk to business as usual and the expansion plans, which are a key part of their medium-term strategy. We see increasing regulation as one of the key risks that investors in petrochemicals should be focused on. Now, as I mentioned, in the prior section, I highlighted the growing weight of regulation around plastic impacts and the significant effort the industry continues to make to stymie concerted action on plastic pollution. I will discuss litigation risk a little more on the next slide. We also note potential significant reputational risks for the investors into the industry from transacting with and investing in businesses perceived as high plastic polluters, as public awareness of plastic pollution grows and the association with those polluters could turn into a liability for investors, as we saw historically with coal and tobacco sectors. Put together, in our view, this large and growing risk register means business as usual is not an option for petrochemical companies or their investors. At the moment, we do not believe these risks are appropriately appreciated or priced into the industry, and this represents a downside risk for investors. So, zooming into litigation risk as an example, as Manon discussed earlier, there's a huge range of chemicals involved in the manufacture of plastics, many of which are known to be harmful to health, for instance, causing cancer or reducing fertility, whilst many others are untested or their impacts are poorly characterised. Now, this knowledge gap is being filled. As we show on the right-hand side of the slide, there's been an explosion in the level of academic work looking at the human health impacts of chemicals associated with plastics. In many ways, this is a ticking time bomb for the industry. How long before these analyses start to crystallize into actual legal challenges and potentially huge payouts? If you think that basically the entire global population is potentially exposed to negative harms from plastics and plastic-associated chemicals, this could be a major headwind in the future. As we note on the left of the slide, we're maybe starting to see the first rumbles of this potential earthquake, with, for instance, 3M paying out billions of dollars related to its manufacture of PFAS, also known as forever chemicals. So to summarize what I've covered, petrochemical companies stand at the start of the plastic value chain. They are the tap pumping out the plastic polymers, but they seem determined to avoid responsibility for their role in plastic pollution. We think this business as usual approach is unsustainable and their expansion plans under threat as part of a growing risk register for the sector. These risks include increasing regulation, notably the ongoing global plastic treaty negotiations, as well as national level efforts. We also note increasing risk of litigation as the science fills in our knowledge gaps on the potential long-term impacts of plastic pollution. We see this growing risk register as underappreciated and believe investors should be engaging with the industry to address these risks and push for a sustainable transition. And with that, I'll hand back to Nicole.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. You highlighted the role the petrochemical industry plays very clearly. And one thing I would just like to reiterate is the development in the policy landscape and the opportunity that we have with the Global Plastics Treaty. If we are to tackle plastic pollution issues, including the reduction of waste, of chemicals of concerns in plastic products, and the necessary reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, then we need the entire plastic value chain to work together to address these challenges. We cannot focus solely on downstream solutions. And this leads us to the work that we have been doing with investors on advocating for petrochemical companies to play their part in addressing plastic pollution issues. With that, I will hand over to Arthur van Mansveld from Achmea Investment Management to talk us through how investors can get involved to help address the petrochemical industry. Arthur, over to you.
Thank you, Nicole, and welcome everybody. Good to have you on this important call. I think we can move on to the next slide immediately. Yes, so this is about the investor statement that we have drawn up, key issues, and I think many of the things were already mentioned by Manon and by Richard early in the call. I think we are all aware of the fact that petrochemicals companies are a major contributor to plastic production. And as a consequence, also largely responsible for the plastic pollution at the end of the life cycle. What we all possibly also know is that plastic polymer production increases the threats of well, plastic pollution, as I said, but also of climate change, biodiversity loss, whereas pollution is a major driver of biodiversity loss. And as Richard pointed out, all the scientific research that points out increasingly to the health risks for also for human beings of this widespread plastic pollutions in all sizes, from major parts to the microplastics that float around the oceans and even into our drinking waters. And I think as investors, we all have targets and commitments to halting biodiversity loss, to preventing climate change, potentially also on preserving human health. And we see that this position of petrochemicals and plans to follow this planned and expected increase in demand that Manon pointed out, the business as usual, that it very much conflicts with the targets and the commitments that we have set on the different policy areas, like on climate and biodiversity. And to achieve climate and nature targets, it's clear that also fossil fuel plastic polymer productions and the production of plastic polymers must be addressed, which we see that companies currently very actively try to avert in the negotiations on the plastics treaty, as Richard already pointed out. Lastly, looking at all the media coverage on the role of petrochemicals in the treaty negotiations and the increased presence of representatives at the last summit, we thought it's currently in the moment, also in the run-up to the next treaty negotiations, to come up with a clear investor statement that we want a different role of the petrochemicals industry, not blocking an ambitious treaty, but taking responsibility and making sure that the whole plastic value chain is addressed in the right way in the Global Plastics Treaty. That brings me to the next slide, the key elements of our investor statement. The first key ask is on transparency in disclosing the strategies and setting clear targets to transition to production of safe and environmentally sound and sustainable plastics, much more towards what we consider as a circular plastics economy. The second ask is to better address the polymers and particularly the chemicals of concern in plastic production, and set targets and strategies to phase out the most hazardous substances. A third element is building better infrastructure aiming at a circular economy, much more towards recycling and alternative materials. That all, as a fourth point, that all asks much more dedicated governance aiming towards this transition and more circular economy. And the fifth key ask is public support to an ambitious international and legally binding instrument for ending plastic pollution, in short, the UN Plastics Treaty. So that's what the statement is about. And just to provide a little context about the investor engagement that many of us has done over the last few years. When I saw the slide of Richard with the three parts of the plastic value chain, the FMCGs, the plastic packages, and petrochemicals, I realized that we have been engaging with the two downstream groups extensively already, but so far to a lesser extent with the petrochemicals. We have joined around 2021 the Business Coalition, supporting a lot of ambitious FMCG companies with their positive contribution to the UN Treaty. Earlier this year, we signed with UNEP-FI this large finance sector statement, raising the financial sector voice in support for a strong and ambitious UN Treaty on plastics. And I realized that much of the this finance statement that actually calls for the total value chain of plastics being included in the treaty, and setting clear targets for the role of different parts in the value chain. That's an important message from the financial sector, and that the role of the petrochemicals currently in the treaty and trying to undermine the treaty very much conflicts with the investor commitments and asks in that UNEP statement. So I think the key ask in this next statement, this statement that calls on the petrochemicals industry, is a very logical next step. That's a very important signal towards the next round of treaty negotiations. I think I will leave it there, Nicole. And if there are questions, then I'm happy to ask. And of course, I hope that many of the participants today are willing to consider signing up this important statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arthur. If we just go to the next slide, you can find the statement here on the slide. You can just scan it, or you can just go onto our website at planettracker.org/petchem-investors, and you'll find the statement there. If you have any further questions, you can also email us directly afterwards. However, we did get a few questions in the chat, and we have a little bit of time. So before we wrap it up, I would just like to bring up some of these questions, and maybe Arthur, Richard, Manon, you can come back on screen. And Richard, maybe I'll start with you. One of the questions that we've received was on the role that developing countries play and the plastics industry within developing countries, kind of keeping in mind what are the impacts maybe on the sector in terms of job security, creating jobs, but also the role that potentially governments play in this and the revenue that this sector brings in.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and I think we always have to be conscious of making sure that any sort of transition in any industry that we're talking about is a just transition, and that it's not paid for by low wage or poor people who lose jobs because of a change. That they've got to be found alternative employment if we are talking about the shuttering of a plant, which we aren't necessarily. I'd say, look, the impacts of plastic are global. But at the moment, quite often are particularly significantly negative in developing markets where there tends to be particularly poor waste management, and historically they've been used as a dumping ground for plastic waste coming out of developed markets. So I think a more sustainable, more responsible plastic industry is a positive for developing markets, full stop, and for then the populations of developing markets. And that investment by the industry into a more sustainable industry structure, be that plants or whatever else they would be required to do, can continue to support jobs in the medium to long term. So I do not see in any way that this has to be a sort of either or. I think that a sustainable plastic industry, and I know we're going to get some questions as to when plastic's being necessary in the future, and that's certainly the case. We need it to be a sustainable industry which takes responsibility, and that one will still employ a lot of people, potentially generate a lot of revenue, but we've got to address those negative environmental and health harm impacts at the same time.
Thank you, and maybe kind of following on from that, with maybe linking back to kind of single-use plastics and the related pollution, and it being a big problem. Obviously, plastics will be required for part of the energy transition. Any of you can take these questions, but how do you think investors, policymakers, or the industry is thinking about it? How are they tackling that?
Yeah, I can start, Richard. Now, I think that Kitty is right that the particular focus is on the single-use plastics, to phase those out, particularly also in packaging, and find alternatives. I think in the durable plastics for longer-term use, their plastics are less of a problem if the end of life challenge is sufficiently solved, that the waste is properly treated and that it's brought into to recycling. But there's particularly a lot to gain in the reduction of single-use plastics, qualified also as unnecessary plastics. And if you look at the scenarios, for example, of OECD in reducing plastic and plastic waste, also there you see that there are substantial gains to make if you only focus on single-use plastics to start with.
Richard, did you want to add anything to that?
I think Arthur's been very good, but yeah, I don't think realistically we're seeing the back of plastic. I mean, one can think of, for instance, medical uses of plastic. Obviously, we had a lot of use during the COVID pandemic. We're all aware of that. But things like blood bags, IV lines, it's a critical part of a lot of these technologies that we're in no way trying to get rid of. So it's really about managing plastic better when we are using it, both in its production and its end of life as well.
And one question that has come up also multiple times before is kind of the alternatives to plastic. Are there any sustainable alternatives? What are next steps? What should investors be looking out for? Richard, could you maybe comment on that?
Sure. So, I mean, traditionally, a lot of the answer to what should we be doing and what are the key things is the classic reduce, reuse, recycle, which is that very big focus on downstream, which I kind of was slightly critical of, perhaps in my prepared remarks. I think that is an important part of what we on a day-to-day basis can do for the corporates. Certainly, investment into sustainable alternatives. So, if we're looking at the overall industry, for instance, decarbonising the electricity they're using, or trying to decarbonise the processes that they use in their plants, is a key step that involves capital investment. We're looking to alternative feedstocks. So be that, as I was mentioning earlier, better management of plastics of end of life. Can we feed that back in? Arthur mentioned a circular economy. There's been work looking at bio-based feedstocks. That's, carbon is carbon to some extent. We can do the chemistry. It's really about the challenge of producing in volume without compromising other issues. So I don't think anyone would support the idea of getting the oil out of petrochemicals by chopping down the Amazon rainforest to grow corn to put into the petrochemical industry. We need to, you've got to be careful about the payoffs that we're taking elsewhere when we make some of these decisions. So it's not always easy answers. If it was, it probably already happening. But there are lots of things that lots of levers people can pull depending on where they stand in society and within the value chain.
Thank you, Richard. And I guess it kind of answers also the question on the shift towards renewable energy and if that can help to reduce plastic waste. Another question we got was our top 3 actionable items that we would recommend to address the plastic pollution crisis. I think maybe I can go first. One of them is to engage with companies that you are invested into, that you have exposure to. And I think you've seen this on the slide earlier. You have that entire value chain. And I think we really want to highlight how important it is to also focus on these petrochemical companies. They have been overlooked for a really long time. And we would encourage all investors and asset owners who have exposure to these companies, but also those who have exposure to the entire plastics value chain. So maybe you don't hold petrochemical companies specifically, but you might hold other companies that are using those plastic pellets that are being made into products, and engage with them. We've set out kind of our key 5 asks, which just to kind of reiterate, we want them to transparently disclose and define strategies. We need to have clear targets, so we need to know what they're working towards. For them to address polymers and chemicals of concerns in their products, to build sustainable infrastructure. That's one of the points that Richard just mentioned as well, when looking for kind of alternatives and how to manage it, establishing good governance, and then lastly, also looking towards the policy landscape, supporting the Global Plastics Treaty. And again, that's also something that investors and asset owners can get involved in supporting these policy developments. There are quite a few groups out there who are working on that, and other organizations who are kind of pushing for that. So I think that would be kind of our key message, is to support the statement to address the plastic pollution crisis, and to start engaging with petrochemical companies. There are quite a few more questions coming in, so let me just quickly have a look. I guess we have a question on cost, which I would actually like to pick up, and that's on plastics being quite inexpensive. Why are they so cheap? What is making it so cheap, Richard?
It's a great question, and I think a good answer historically is they've been, I suppose, in some sense, subsidized by what else is coming out of the ground when you take oil. So you've got these plants that are processing oil to produce gasoline, which was the major sort of cash crop from the oil, and petrochemicals were just a sort of offtake that you could then, you had to use them, or they were available really cheaply because it wasn't really what you're going after. Swapping volumes out of gasoline, I think the big petchem players see pumping out more petrochemicals, trying to up the volume they get per barrel of oil as a future medium-term strategy is a big part of their belief. But they've got the assets on the ground. There are oil wells, there are refineries, everything's already there. You're not sort of building this industry from ground zero. We're starting with a lot of infrastructure and capital having been spent already. So that really contributes to primary, virgin plastic being very cheap, partly because of the fact that it's sort of been subsidized historically by gasoline.
And then maybe just to finish it off, because that often comes up as well, looking towards something like plastic credits, whether it works, what would the scale of impact be? Is that something that could help?
I will bounce it if Manon will also have a comment as well. But I mean, I think anything that addresses the issue of plastic pollution, to some extent, we should welcome it, because it is a growing problem and one that is going to require a lot of different answers. In no way, when I was saying a reduce, reuse, recycle isn't the answer, am I saying it's not part of the answer? It is part of the solution, but we need to be pulling a lot of different levers. And so something like plastic credits that maybe can incentivize better waste management, can incentivize financing into the sector to address plastic pollution could be a good thing. The worry is always how these things are regulated. We've seen this with the carbon credit market. that there have been real questions around some of the schemes that have been used and whether or not they're actually providing any actual benefit. So I think a well-designed, well-audited plastic credits could be a useful addition to the armory for addressing plastic pollution.
Okay. We have quite a few more questions coming in. We won't be able to answer all of them today, I'm afraid, but what we'll do is we'll send a follow-up via email. So just to kind of summarize, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to all of our speakers, but also I hope that what the webinar has shown is why it is so important that we address the petrochemical industry and what the role is in helping to address plastic pollution. You can find the full statement on our website. You will also find an FAQ there and the page to sign on. On the page itself, you'll also find a full list of companies that we are addressing with the statement. And as I've mentioned, we are encouraging all investors and all asset owners who have exposure to the plastics value chain. So not just petrochemical companies, but also converters, PCMP companies, retailers, brands to support this statement. And more broadly, we're inviting any financial institutions to sign on who want to address the plastic pollution issues more holistically. And I hope that kind of came across in this as well, think that the timing is quite vital for this statement, as we are in between of what looks to be the final round of negotiations for the Global Plastics Treaty later this year. And it is evident from the previous round that the petrochemical industry needs to be more involved in helping to tackle plastic pollution issues. So we hope that you can support the statement. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us directly. You can see my contact details on the screen. They are nicole@planet-tracker.org. And the statement is open to sign on for another few weeks. So yes, we hope that we will see your signature there and that we will hear from you very soon. Thank you very much and goodbye.